Bangkok, Thailand. The Continental Hotel Bar on Wireless Road. Tuesday evening, March 27th, 1968. One of the few establishments in Bangkok where American military personnel and civilians mixed freely with Thai businessmen, and with the kind of people who operated in the shadows between legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise, where deals were negotiated over expensive whiskey in an atmosphere that suggested respectability while facilitating transactions that would never appear in official records, where the Vietnam War, that was raging 200 miles to the east, created opportunities for people smart enough and ruthless enough to profit from conflict that was consuming American lives and American resources at unprecedented rates. At a corner table, sitting alone but watched carefully by three Thai men positioned strategically throughout the bar who would kill anyone who approached without permission, sat Frank Lucas, 38 years old, already successful as a heroine distributor in New York, but in Bangkok specifically, to expand his operation beyond anything he'd built previously, to establish connections that would transform him from a significant player in New York's drug trade into potentially the most successful black criminal in American history. Lucas had been in Bangkok for 3 days, had spent those days meeting with opium suppliers in the Golden Triangle region, where Burma, Thailand, and Laos intersected, had negotiated prices and quality standards and delivery schedules for pure heroin that he would import to the United States and distribute at prices that would undercut every competitor while still generating profit margins that were almost obscene in their magnitude. The Asian connections were working exactly as Bumpy Johnson had promised they would before Johnson's death earlier that year. Exactly as Lucas had planned when he'd first conceived the strategy of bypassing Italian middlemen and importing directly from source. But Lucas had identified a problem, a significant obstacle that threatened his entire operation. Getting the heroin from Thailand to the United States without detection by customs officials, without interdiction by law enforcement, without losing shipments that represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment and millions in potential profit. Traditional smuggling methods, hiding drugs in luggage, in shipping containers, in commercial cargo, were risky and unreliable, subject to random searches and to the increasing sophistication of customs enforcement that was specifically targeting drug importation as the heroin epidemic in America worsened. Lucas needed something better. He needed a smuggling method that was essentially immune to customs inspection, that could move large quantities reliably and repeatedly, that wouldn't attract attention from law enforcement agencies that were becoming increasingly aggressive about interdicting drug shipments. Lucas had been thinking about this problem for months, had considered and rejected dozens of potential solutions, had finally identified what he believed was the perfect answer, but implementing it would require connections he didn't have, would require cooperation from people who had no reason to help him, would require a deal that was so audacious and so potentially lucrative that everyone involved would be willing to take risks that would normally be unthinkable. At 8:47 p.m., 2 men entered the Continental Hotel Bar, both Americans, both wearing civilian clothes, but moving with the bearing that suggested military background, both scanning the room with the practiced awareness of people who'd spent years in situations where lack of vigilance could be fatal. The men were Master Sergeant Jack Sullivan and Master Sergeant Marcus Daniels, both career military personnel currently stationed with the 1st Logistical Command in Saigon, both responsible for coordinating the return of military equipment and supplies, and personnel from Vietnam to the United States, both in Bangkok on what their official orders described as procurement consultation, but what was actually a meeting they'd requested with Frank Lucas after receiving word through certain channels that Lucas was in Bangkok and was looking for people with specific expertise in military logistics. Sullivan and Daniels had been referred to Lucas through a network of corrupt military personnel who'd been profiting from the Vietnam War through various schemes, selling military supplies on the black market, facilitating drug shipments for Asian criminal organizations, skimming money from procurement budgets, and generally using their positions within the military logistics system to generate income that far exceeded their military salaries. Sullivan and Daniels weren't the most corrupt military personnel in Vietnam. That distinction probably belonged to officers at higher ranks who were stealing at scales that made millions rather than thousands, but they were corrupt enough and positioned well enough that they could facilitate certain arrangements if the price was right and if the risks were manageable. Sullivan and Daniels walked directly to Lucas's table, having been told by intermediaries exactly where to find him, sat down without asking permission, and looked at Lucas with expressions that combined curiosity and calculation, understanding that this meeting had been requested by Lucas, that Lucas wanted something from them, that their leverage in this negotiation came from their positions within the military logistics system rather than from any criminal reputation or organizational power. "Mr. Lucas," Sullivan said, his voice quiet enough that nearby patrons couldn't hear, professional in tone but carrying an edge that suggested Sullivan understood exactly who Lucas was and what he did, and was neither impressed nor intimidated. "We understand you've been asking around about military transport logistics, about how equipment and supplies move from Vietnam back to the States, about whether there might be opportunities for mutually beneficial arrangements. So, here we are. Tell us what you want. Tell us what you're offering, and we'll determine whether there's business to be done or whether we're wasting each other's time." Lucas looked at Sullivan and Daniels, evaluated them with the same cold calculation he applied to every potential business partner, determining whether these men were serious operators who could deliver what Lucas needed, or whether they were just military personnel looking to make quick money without having the capability or the courage to follow through on complex arrangements. Lucas decided they were worth the gamble, decided that their positions within the logistics system were valuable enough that testing their willingness to cooperate was worth the risk of exposing his plan to people who might potentially inform on him if they chose moral objection over financial gain. "Here's what I need," Lucas began, his voice carrying absolute confidence, the confidence of someone who'd already determined that what he was proposing was possible and profitable, and that the only question was whether these specific military personnel were capable of executing it. "I'm importing heroin from Thailand to New York. Pure heroin purchased in the Golden Triangle, processed in Bangkok, shipped to the United States where I cut it and distribute it through wholesale networks. I'm currently moving approximately 50 kilograms per month, using traditional smuggling methods, hiding it in commercial shipping containers, in luggage carried by couriers, methods that are expensive and risky, and that limit my volume because I can't risk moving larger quantities through channels that are subject to customs inspection. Lucas continued, watching Sullivan and Daniels for reactions, for any sign that they were uncomfortable with what he was proposing, or that they were the kind of people who would report this conversation to military authorities or to law enforcement. What I need is a smuggling method that bypasses customs entirely, that's immune to inspection, that can reliably move 500 to 1,000 kilograms per month from Thailand to the United States without risk of interdiction. And I believe I've identified exactly how to do that. By hiding heroin in military cargo that's being shipped from Vietnam back to the States as part of normal logistics operations, cargo that receives minimal inspection because it's military rather than commercial, that moves through military channels rather than through civilian customs procedures. Sullivan and Daniels exchanged glances, understanding immediately what Lucas was proposing, recognizing that he was asking them to use their positions within the military logistics system to facilitate drug smuggling on a scale that would be unprecedented, that would generate extraordinary profits, but that would also constitute serious federal crimes that could result in decades of prison time if discovered. But neither Sullivan nor Daniels showed moral outrage or refused the proposition outright. They were career military personnel who'd already crossed lines between legitimate service and criminal activity, who'd already decided that profiting from their positions was acceptable, who were now just calculating whether Lucas's proposal offered sufficient profit to justify the additional risks. "That's an interesting idea," Daniels said carefully, his voice neutral, not committing to anything but not refusing either. "Hypothetically, if someone were to facilitate what you're describing, if someone were to arrange for heroin to be hidden in military cargo being shipped from Vietnam to the United States, what would that be worth to you? What percentage of your operation would you be willing to pay for that kind of access?" Lucas had anticipated this question, had already calculated what he was willing to pay for reliable military smuggling access, had determined that paying substantial percentages of his profit would still leave him wealthier than any competing heroin distributor in New York, because the volume he could move and the reliability of military transport would generate profits that dwarfed what he was currently making through traditional smuggling methods. "I'll pay you 20% of my gross revenue from heroin that's smuggled through military channels," Lucas said, his voice showing no hesitation, making it clear this was a serious offer rather than an opening negotiating position. Not net profit, gross revenue. Every kilo of heroin that enters the United States through military transport, you get 20% of what I sell it for. I'm currently selling pure heroin wholesale for approximately $50,000 per kilo. If you help me move 500 kilos per month, that's $25 million in gross revenue monthly, which means you split $5 million per month between however many people need to be involved in making this work. That's $60 million annually. Split between 2 people, that's $30 million each per year. Split between 10 people, that's $6 million each per year. However you want to structure it, whatever you need to pay. To other military personnel, to ensure cooperation and silence, that's your decision. I just pay you 20% of gross, and you handle all the logistics and all the payoffs necessary to make the system work. The silence that followed Lucas's offer lasted approximately 30 seconds, while Sullivan and Daniels processed what he'd just proposed, while they calculated the amounts involved, while they understood that Lucas was offering them the opportunity to become extraordinarily wealthy through a scheme that would use their military positions to facilitate drug smuggling on scales that would dwarf anything any corrupt military personnel had previously attempted. 20% of gross is substantial, Sullivan said finally, his voice showing that Lucas's offer had definitely gotten their attention, that they were now seriously considering whether they could actually implement what Lucas was proposing. But implementation would require cooperation from multiple people, other personnel in logistics, people in cargo handling, people at receiving facilities in the States. And the more people involved, the greater the risk that someone talks or that someone gets caught and implicates everyone else. So, before we commit to anything, we need to understand exactly how you're proposing to hide the heroin in military cargo, how you expect to retrieve it once it reaches the States, and how you plan to ensure that all the heroin gets to you rather than being stolen by military personnel who realize they're handling extremely valuable cargo. Lucas smiled, appreciating that Sullivan was thinking systematically about implementation rather than just being dazzled by the money, that Sullivan understood that the scheme only worked if the logistics were carefully planned and if all the people involved had incentives that kept them loyal rather than tempted to steal or inform. Here's how this works, Lucas explained, pulling a notebook from his jacket and showing Sullivan and Daniels diagrams he'd drawn, organizational charts that illustrated exactly how the smuggling operation would function. The heroin gets packaged in Bangkok into metal containers that are sealed and labeled as military equipment parts, specifically as components for aircraft or vehicles that are being returned to the States for maintenance. The containers are approximately the size of toolboxes, small enough to be easily handled, but large enough to hold 20 to 30 kilograms of heroin per container. The containers are mixed in with legitimate military cargo, actual equipment parts, personal effects of soldiers rotating home, whatever logistics is shipping at that particular time. Lucas continued, the containers are marked with specific codes that identify them as containing heroin rather than actual equipment parts. Those codes are only known to people who are part of our arrangement, military personnel who are being paid to facilitate the smuggling. The containers get loaded onto military transport planes or ships, along with hundreds of other containers of legitimate cargo. They move through military channels without customs inspection, because military cargo is generally exempt from civilian customs procedures. The planes or ships arrive at military facilities in the United States, Travis Air Force Base in California, or various naval facilities on the East Coast, depending on what transport is available, and where the receiving facilities have personnel who are part of our arrangement. At the receiving facility, personnel who are being paid to cooperate identify the containers based on the codes, separate them from legitimate cargo, and hold them for retrieval by my people. I send trusted associates to pick up the containers using whatever cover story is necessary. They're civilian contractors picking up equipment for maintenance. They're delivery drivers collecting cargo. Whatever works at that particular facility. The containers are transported to secure locations where I process the heroin, cut it, and distribute it through my wholesale networks. Lucas looked up from his notebook, meeting Sullivan's eyes directly. The beauty of this system is compartmentalization. Most of the military personnel involved never see the heroin, never know they're handling drugs rather than legitimate cargo. They're just following instructions to mark and move certain containers and to look the other way when my people collect them. Only a small number of people, you two, maybe a few others at key positions, actually know what's being smuggled and how the system works. Everyone else just knows they're being paid to facilitate certain cargo movements without asking questions. And because the heroin never moves through civilian customs, because it's traveling as military cargo the entire time, there's virtually no risk of interdiction or inspection. Sullivan and Daniels looked at each other, communicating silently in the way that people who've worked together for years can communicate without words, both understanding that Lucas had clearly thought through the logistics, that his plan was sophisticated and carefully structured, that it had a legitimate chance of working if they could recruit the right people at the right positions within the military logistics system. "We'll need time to identify people who can be trusted," Sullivan said finally, his tone indicating he was no longer questioning whether to do this, but was instead planning how to implement it. "We'll need to make sure that everyone at critical positions, cargo handlers, transport coordinators, receiving facility personnel, can be either recruited to actively cooperate or persuaded to look the other way when certain containers move through their areas. That's going to require careful vetting, generous payments to ensure loyalty, and probably some leverage over people who might be tempted to inform or steal." Lucas nodded. "I'll give you 3 months to build your network. During that time, I'll continue using traditional smuggling methods to maintain my current operation. But starting in July 1968, I want to begin moving heroin through military channels. Start small, maybe 50 kilos, in the first shipment to test the system and ensure everything works as planned. If that's successful, we scale up gradually over the following months until we're moving 500 to 1,000 kilos monthly. And remember, 20% of gross revenue means everyone involved gets wealthy as long as the system keeps working. That gives everyone incentive to maintain security, to avoid getting greedy and stealing, to ensure that this operation continues for years rather than collapsing after a few months because someone made stupid mistakes." The deal was struck that evening at the Continental Hotel Bar in Bangkok. Sullivan and Daniels agreed to use their positions within military logistics to facilitate drug smuggling, to recruit other military personnel who would cooperate, to establish procedures for marking and moving heroin-filled containers through military transport channels, to ensure that Lucas's drugs reached the United States without customs inspection or interdiction. Over the next 3 months, March through June 1968, Sullivan and Daniels built their network. They identified cargo handlers, transport coordinators, and receiving facility personnel who could be trusted, sometimes because those personnel were already corrupt and looking for opportunities to profit from their positions, sometimes because Sullivan and Daniels had leverage over them through knowledge of other rule violations or personal problems, sometimes because the money being offered was simply too substantial to refuse. The first shipment moved in July 1968. 53 kilograms of pure heroin, packaged in 3 metal containers, labeled as aircraft hydraulic components, mixed in with legitimate military cargo being transported from Thailand to Travis Air Force Base in California. The shipment moved without incident, arrived at Travis Air Force Base, was identified by cooperating personnel using the code system Lucas had established, was collected by Lucas's associates, who presented themselves as civilian contractors, and was transported to New York, where Lucas processed and distributed it through his wholesale networks. The system worked flawlessly. The second shipment in August 1968 moved 120 kilograms. The third shipment in September moved 210 kilograms. By October 1968, Lucas was moving approximately 400 kilograms monthly through military channels, generating gross revenues of roughly $20 million per month, paying Sullivan and Daniels $4 million monthly to facilitate the smuggling, keeping approximately $12 million monthly after deducting costs for purchasing the heroin in Thailand, for cutting and packaging, for paying off corrupt police and politicians in New York, and for various other operational expenses. The financial results were extraordinary. From July 1968 through December 1974, approximately 6.5 years of military-facilitated smuggling before Lucas's eventual arrest, the operation moved approximately 30,000 kilograms of pure heroin from Southeast Asia to the United States, generated gross revenues of roughly $1.5 billion, and produced net profits for Lucas of approximately $900 million after all costs and payoffs were deducted. Those numbers, 30,000 kilograms of heroin, $1.5 billion in revenue, $900 million in profit, made Frank Lucas's operation the most successful drug trafficking enterprise in American history up to that point, surpassing anything Italian organized crime families had built, exceeding what any other black criminal had achieved, establishing Lucas as someone whose wealth and power rivaled legitimate corporations and who operated at scales that seemed impossible for individual criminals to achieve. But the true significance of Lucas's deal with military personnel wasn't just the money it generated or the volume of heroin it moved. The significance was that Lucas had identified and exploited a fundamental vulnerability in the military logistics system, that cargo moving through military channels received minimal inspection because authorities assumed military personnel were trustworthy, that military cargo was legitimate, that corruption within the military was limited to small-scale theft rather than systematic drug smuggling at industrial scales. Lucas had recognized that the Vietnam War created perfect conditions for his scheme. Thousands of military flights and shipments moving from Southeast Asia to the United States every week overwhelmed logistics personnel who couldn't carefully inspect every container, demoralized military personnel who were susceptible to corruption because they were serving in an increasingly unpopular war for salaries that were inadequate, and most importantly, customs officials who had no authority to inspect military cargo, who were focused on commercial shipments rather than on military transport, who never imagined that American military personnel would facilitate drug smuggling on scales that Lucas was achieving. The military smuggling route became known within Lucas's organization as the Cadaver Connection, though this name was somewhat misleading. Popular legend claimed that Lucas hid heroin in the body cavities of dead American soldiers being returned from Vietnam, that coffins containing fallen servicemen also contained drugs, that Lucas was literally profiting from American deaths in ways that were morally grotesque beyond normal criminal behavior. The reality was less dramatic, but more systematic. Lucas did occasionally use coffins and body transport to move heroin. The special reverence and reduced inspection given to remains of fallen soldiers made coffins relatively safe smuggling vessels. But the vast majority of Lucas's military smuggling used exactly the method he'd described to Sullivan and Daniels. Heroin hidden in containers labeled as equipment parts, moved through normal logistics channels, collected at receiving facilities by Lucas's people posing as contractors or delivery personnel. The distinction mattered morally, but not operationally. Whether Lucas was hiding drugs in coffins or in equipment containers, he was exploiting military logistics to smuggle heroin, was bribing military personnel to facilitate drug trafficking, was using America's war infrastructure to import poison that would destroy American communities. The scale and sophistication of his operation, not the specific methods, were what made Lucas's military deal historically significant. Sullivan and Daniels, the two master sergeants who'd made the original deal with Lucas in Bangkok in March 1968, became extraordinarily wealthy from their 20% cut of Lucas's gross revenue. Both men retired from military service in the early 1970s as millionaires, having accumulated wealth that was impossible to explain through military salaries, but that they managed to hide through offshore accounts and through investments in legitimate businesses that laundered their drug money. Neither Sullivan nor Daniels was ever prosecuted for their role in Lucas's smuggling operation. When Lucas was finally arrested in January 1975, he cooperated with authorities, provided information about his organization and about the people who'd helped him, but notably refused to identify the specific military personnel who'd facilitated his military smuggling route, apparently because there was some honor, even among criminals, about not exposing military contacts, or perhaps because Lucas calculated that maintaining silence about military connections would earn him considerations during sentencing. The military itself conducted investigations after Lucas's arrest, tried to determine how he'd managed to smuggle such large quantities through military logistics without detection, interviewed hundreds of personnel who'd been stationed at relevant facilities during the relevant time periods. But the investigations were largely unsuccessful because Lucas's compartmentalization had been effective, because most personnel involved had known only small pieces of the overall scheme, because the people who knew the most, Sullivan and Daniels, and perhaps a dozen others, had already retired and weren't subject to military jurisdiction, and weren't stupid enough to confess to crimes that could result in decades of federal prison time. The legacy of Lucas's military deal was complex. On one hand, it demonstrated extraordinary criminal innovation. Lucas had recognized an opportunity that no one else had exploited at comparable scale, had built relationships with military personnel who could facilitate smuggling, had established systems that moved industrial quantities of heroin reliably for years. On the other hand, it represented profound corruption of military institutions, exploitation of American war infrastructure for personal profit, and complicity by military personnel who'd betrayed their duties and their fellow soldiers for money. The deal also demonstrated something important about the Vietnam War era, that the war had created conditions where traditional authorities and controls broke down, where corruption flourished because oversight was inadequate, and because personnel were demoralized and susceptible to financial temptation, where criminals like Lucas could exploit military logistics in ways that would have been impossible during more carefully managed conflicts. Tuesday evening, March 27, 1968, at the Continental Hotel Bar in Bangkok. The night Frank Lucas made a deal with two master sergeants that would transform his heroin operation from significant to historic, that would make him hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 6 years, that would move 30,000 kilograms of heroin from Southeast Asia to American streets through military logistics channels that were supposed to be supporting American war efforts rather than facilitating drug trafficking. The deal that built an empire, the arrangement that exploited military infrastructure to smuggle heroin at industrial scales, the network of corrupt military personnel who chose wealth over duty, and who facilitated drug trafficking that destroyed countless lives in exchange for percentages of revenue that made them millionaires. The conversation that lasted perhaps 2 hours, but that resulted in a smuggling operation that generated $1.5 billion in revenue over 6 years, that produced $900 million in profit for Lucas, that paid out approximately $300 million to corrupt military personnel who facilitated the scheme, that moved enough pure heroin to devastate American communities throughout the 1970s. What Frank Lucas told Master Sergeant Sullivan and Daniels that evening in Bangkok wasn't just a business proposal. It was a blueprint for the most successful drug trafficking operation in American history up to that point. A systematic exploitation of military logistics that demonstrated how criminals could use war infrastructure for profit, how corruption could flourish when oversight was inadequate, and when financial temptations exceeded any moral constraints that military service was supposed to instill. The deal that made Frank Lucas one of the wealthiest criminals in American history. The arrangement that turned Vietnam War logistics into drug smuggling routes. The night when military duty was subordinated to criminal profit, when American war infrastructure became the foundation for heroin distribution, when two career military sergeants decided that Frank Lucas's offer of 20% of gross revenue was worth betraying everything military service was supposed to represent. March 27th, 1968. The Continental Hotel Bar in Bangkok. The deal that changed everything. The arrangement that would generate hundreds of millions of dollars and would move tens of thousands of kilograms of heroin and would corrupt military logistics and would ultimately be exposed when Lucas was arrested in 1975, but by then the damage was done, the profits were made, the heroin had been distributed, and American communities had paid the price for a criminal innovation that exploited war for profit on scales that shocked even experienced law enforcement when the full scope of Lucas's operation was finally understood.